The city was alive with lights, towering skyscrapers, and the endless rush of people chasing their dreams. But amidst the noise and movement, there was a small figure curled up near the grand entrance of one of the biggest companies in town. A boy, no older than 10, lay there, his tiny frame shivering in the cold night air. His clothes were worn out, his face smeared with dust, and his bare feet pressed against the cold pavement. He wasn't sleeping out of choice. He had nowhere else to go. As the sun began to rise, the glass doors of the company swung open. Employees in crisp suits walked past him, barely sparing him a glance. They were used to seeing homeless people in the city, and like most, they pretended not to notice. But then footsteps stopped near him. A deep, commanding voice broke the morning silence. "What is this?" The man scoffed, his voice laced with irritation. Standing before the boy was none other than Richard Caldwell, the owner of the massive corporation behind him. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, feared by his employees and admired by the business world. Dressed in an expensive tailored suit, his polished shoes gleamed under the morning light. But his eyes, sharp and cold, were filled with disdain as they scanned the child blocking his pristine entrance. The boy stirred at the sound of the voice. He blinked up at the man, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He didn't know who Richard Caldwell was, but he could sense that the man wasn't pleased to see him there. "You can't sleep here," Richard snapped, his lips curling in disgust. "This is private property, not a shelter for street rats." A few employees had stopped to watch, exchanging uneasy glances but saying nothing. No one dared to speak against their boss. The boy slowly sat up, rubbing his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply lowered his head, as if he had heard those words 1,000 times before. Richard's patience thinned as he looked down at the child. He had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way to the top, and he believed that people made their own fate. If this boy was on the streets, it was because he was weak. That's how the world worked. "Get up," he ordered. "Leave before I call security." The boy nodded silently, gathering his thin blanket. He moved with slow, tired motions, as though the weight of the world rested on his tiny shoulders. But just as he tried to stand, his legs gave out beneath him. His body collapsed onto the pavement, too weak to support itself. A small gasp rippled through the watching crowd. Some of the employees exchanged glances, but no one dared to step forward. Richard sighed in exasperation. "Unbelievable," he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Now I have to deal with this." His words were cold, but beneath his annoyance, there was a flicker of hesitation. A part of him, one he had buried long ago, felt something. A memory, perhaps. But just as quickly as it surfaced, he shoved it away. He waved a dismissive hand. "Fine," he said. "Someone get rid of him." At that moment, a voice rang out, stopping everyone in their tracks. "Wait." A woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice was firm, filled with quiet strength. All eyes turned toward her, including Richard's. It was Olivia Moore, one of the senior employees at the company. She wasn't the kind to draw attention to herself, but something about the scene unfolding before her struck a nerve. She couldn't just stand there and watch. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Olivia, this has nothing to do with you." But Olivia didn't back down. She knelt beside the boy, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "He's not some problem to be gotten rid of," she said softly, yet there was a sharpness in her tone. "He's a child." Richard scoffed. "And what do you suggest?" "We take him in, feed him, give him a job." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but Olivia didn't flinch. She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Maybe instead of pushing him away, we should ask why he's here in the first place." Silence stretched between them. The employees watched, waiting to see how their boss would respond. For the first time in years, Richard found himself speechless. The boy, still on the ground, looked between them, his tired eyes reflecting something Richard hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. And in that moment, something shifted in the air. But whether it was enough to change a man like Richard Caldwell, that remained to be seen. Richard stared at Olivia, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of his employees. His entire empire had been built on discipline, order, and strength. Sympathy had no place in business, and certainly not in his world. "You don't understand how things work, Olivia," Richard said, his voice sharp but controlled. "This city is filled with people like him. If you help one, another 100 will come knocking. It's just how life is." Olivia didn't look away. Maybe that's because people like you keep shutting the door in their faces. A few employees exchanged uneasy glances. No one had ever spoken to Richard like that. But Olivia wasn't trying to challenge him. She was simply saying what was right. The boy, still on the cold pavement, remained quiet, as if used to being ignored and talked about rather than talked to. His frail hands gripped the thin blanket he had tried to sleep with. Olivia turned her attention back to him and gently asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated, as if the answer itself was a burden. "Daniel," he whispered. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Fine, Olivia. You want to play hero. Go ahead. Take him home if you care so much." He turned to walk away, dismissing the situation entirely. To him, this conversation was over. But Olivia wasn't finished. "You grew up poor too, didn't you?" Richard froze. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He turned back slowly, his expression guarded. No one at the company dared to bring up his past. Most didn't even know the details. But Olivia had done her research. "I read about you," she continued, standing up. "You weren't born into this wealth. You clawed your way up. Isn't that right?" Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "And that's exactly why I know pity doesn't help," he snapped. "I worked for everything I have. No one gave me a handout. This boy needs to learn the same." Olivia shook her head. "There's a difference between giving a handout and giving a hand." She gestured to Daniel. "Look at him. He's just a kid, Richard. Do you really think he has the same chances you did?" For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Richard's eyes flickered to Daniel, and something stirred deep inside him, something he had buried for decades. The sight of the boy's sunken eyes, the exhaustion on his face, the quiet acceptance of his situation, it was too familiar. Years ago, that had been him. He had been the child standing outside restaurants, watching through the glass as people ate hot meals. He had been the one ignored on the streets, struggling to survive, learning to toughen up because kindness was rare and survival was cruel. But he had fought his way out. And in his mind, if he could do it, then anyone could. He forced himself to shake off the memory. Life doesn't care about who's struggling, Olivia. If you're weak, you get left behind. Olivia sighed. And if no one ever reaches out, then what? They stay on the streets forever. Daniel watched the two adults, unsure of what to say. He had been through enough to know that people either ignored him or treated him like a nuisance. But Olivia was different. She spoke as if he mattered, as if his existence wasn't just an inconvenience. Richard checked his watch. He had a meeting to get to, and he had wasted enough time on this conversation. He turned to his assistant. "Get security to take care of this." The words stung more than they should have. Take care of this. As if he was nothing more than a problem to be removed. Daniel clutched his blanket tighter. He had learned a long time ago that begging didn't change anything. People like Richard Caldwell never cared. But just as security stepped forward, something unexpected happened. Daniel's legs wobbled as he tried to stand, but instead of stepping away, he turned to face Richard directly. His small voice, quiet yet firm, cut through the air. "You say I have to be strong," Daniel said. "I am." Richard blinked. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "I sleep on the streets every night. I go days without food. I wake up not knowing if I'll survive another day. And you think I'm weak." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion and frustration. "You think you're strong because you have money. You had chances. I never got any." Silence fell over the crowd. Richard hadn't expected this. The boy wasn't pleading, wasn't crying. He was simply stating the truth. And somehow, those words hit harder than anything Olivia had said. Something inside Richard twisted. He had told himself for years that strength was about power, about building a fortress so high that no one could touch him. But what if real strength wasn't just about standing tall, but about surviving when everything was against you? For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't have an immediate response. The employees watched, waiting to see what their boss would do. Olivia placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "If strength is all that matters to you, Richard, then you should recognize it when you see it." Richard inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening around the strap of his briefcase. His entire life, he had believed that people had to fend for themselves, that helping others only made them dependent. But as he stood there, looking into the eyes of the boy before him, something in his perspective started to crack. He had been so certain that kindness was weakness. But what if it was? For the first time, Richard Caldwell hesitated. And that hesitation was the first sign of change. Richard stood there, unmoving. The weight of Daniel's words, the fire in his eyes, lingered in the air like an unshakable presence. Around them, the employees remained silent, waiting for their boss to react. But for the first time in years, Richard didn't have a quick answer, no cold dismissal, no sharp remark. Instead, he felt something strange, something uncomfortable. Doubt. His whole life, he had believed in one truth: the strong survive, the weak are left behind. But looking at this boy, he realized that Daniel had survived worse than Richard ever had at his age. The difference: Richard had been given small chances along the way, even if they weren't obvious at the time. A mentor, a helping hand, someone who saw potential in him before he saw it himself. Without those moments, he would have never made it. So what if Daniel never got that chance? What if he was left out here to keep fighting battles he had no weapons for? Richard exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the entrance of his building. The crowd watched, confused. Olivia's face fell in disappointment. She had hoped, just for a moment, that something in him had shifted. Then, just as Richard reached the door, he stopped. He glanced over his shoulder and called out, his voice firm yet different. "Come inside." Everyone blinked. Daniel's tired face twisted in confusion. What? Richard didn't repeat himself. He simply held the door open, waiting. A murmur rippled through the employees. Was this really happening? Olivia's lips parted in surprise. "You're letting him in?" Richard sighed, irritated at his own decision. He needs food, doesn't he? His tone was sharp, but there was something else underneath it, something almost reluctant. "I'm not running a charity, but I'm not going to stand here and argue all morning either. Let's go." Daniel hesitated, unsure if this was real. He had never been invited inside anywhere before. But then Olivia gave him an encouraging nod, and slowly he stepped forward, walking past the doors of the company. The warm air hit him instantly. The inside was bright, polished, and filled with the scent of fresh coffee. Employees stared as he entered, unsure how to react. Some looked at Richard, waiting for him to change his mind, but he didn't. Instead, he simply walked ahead, expecting them to follow. Minutes later, Daniel sat at a long, polished table in the cafeteria, staring at a plate of food he never could have imagined eating. Warm eggs, toast, fresh fruit, things he hadn't tasted in so long. His hands hovered over the plate, hesitant. Richard sat across from him, watching. "Eat," he ordered. "I don't like wasting time." Daniel picked up his fork and took a bite. The warmth spread through his empty stomach, and before he knew it, he was eating faster, unable to stop himself. Olivia smiled softly from beside him. Richard, however, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He still wasn't sure why he was doing this. Maybe it was Olivia's words. Maybe it was Daniel's defiance. Or maybe, deep down, it was because he saw himself in the boy more than he wanted to admit. "You don't have a family?" Richard asked suddenly. His voice was still sharp, but there was no malice in it. Daniel shook his head, chewing slowly. "No." Richard studied him for a long moment. "How long have you been on the streets?" Daniel swallowed before answering. "A year." Something in Richard's expression hardened. He didn't respond, but his jaw clenched slightly. A year was a long time to survive alone, especially for a child. After a moment, he stood up. "Come with me." Daniel wiped his mouth and quickly followed. Olivia, curious, did the same. Richard led them to his office, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. He sat behind his desk, then grabbed his phone, dialing a number. "Who are you calling?" Olivia asked. Richard ignored her as the line connected. "Yes, I need someone from social services at my office." "Immediately." He paused, listening. "No, I don't want him in a shelter. Find a real solution. I'll handle the cost." Another pause. "Good." When he hung up, Olivia stared at him in shock. "You're helping him." Richard sighed, rubbing his temple. "I don't do charity, Olivia. But if a kid has survived this long, he deserves a chance." He looked at Daniel. "You want to work." Daniel hesitated. "Work?" Richard nodded. "I'm not going to throw money at you, but I can give you an opportunity. If you're as strong as you say, prove it. Learn. Grow. Make something of yourself." Daniel straightened. "I will." Richard smirked slightly, though it was barely noticeable. "We'll see." A few days later, Daniel found himself in a small but comfortable place to stay, arranged by Richard himself. It wasn't much, but it was warm, safe, and his. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have to sleep on the streets. Over the following months, he started coming to Richard's company, not as a beggar, but as a worker, learning, observing, growing. Richard was tough on him, but Daniel never backed down. And slowly, something changed between them. Richard, a man who had believed only in strength and power, found himself mentoring a boy who had nothing, but also had the potential to be everything. One evening, as Richard watched Daniel working at a desk, Olivia approached him. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Richard scoffed. "I just made an investment." But Olivia smiled knowingly. "Maybe. Or maybe you just remembered what it was like to be in his shoes." Richard didn't reply. He just glanced at Daniel, who was focused, determined, and for the first time, hopeful. And maybe, just maybe, Richard Caldwell had changed more than he realized.